Continuing with our discussion of the net zero campuses, what am I doing here? Let's go into display mode. Of course, as we talked in adaptation and elsewhere in sustainability practices and also in sustaining the commons, planning and strategizing and having best practices is always very critical. Financing comes next, and unlike adaptation where you need very local risk information, net zero can keep going to just focusing on decarbonizing and on equity and injustice, so that your net zero practices don't just have a tunnel vision on carbon but also worry about the unintended consequences, if any, of your actions. So design a net zero plan and understand the benefits and challenges. So that's where you come into understanding what the issues of equity and justice may be. A long-term net zero plan or strategy is required to take the university from business as usual, which is very difficult to change track and have a transformation, but to go to a net zero university, that's what you need. This plan will be the guiding document or strategy along the journey. It's therefore important that it's carefully crafted and builds in the solutions to hurdles that may be encountered along the way. It's like a constitutional statement you will develop and put in place, and then have the ability to modify it and have flexibility as you go along. Two common barriers include ensuring the net zero focused projects are financially viable and that there is enough support from within the university to drive change. You cannot imagine great ideas that are financially simply not viable. We are not talking about cost benefit analysis, but just in terms of financing the transformation needed, unless the plans are financially viable. The University Advisory Panel for this project has identified common challenges and barriers to implementing net zero initiatives. Whilst there is no one-size-fits-all solution, ensuring the support and structures are in place to drive change is a key step in the net zero process. Within India, for example, you have central government institutions like IITs, ICERs, central universities which are well funded, and most of the IITs have rich alumni who keep pumping money back, but most of the state universities do not have such resources, often infested with corrupt practices and generally corruption. So you need location specific, campus specific plans to make it happen. It's important to carefully consider the university's context as well, and to build in solutions to common challenges within the overarching net zero plan. We can still draw some typologies and general guidances, which we will do here. Some of the key challenges and barriers which may be faced at different stages of the net zero journey include difficulty in financing or resourcing initiatives. This is always the big one. You make a nice plan and some government of university official will say there is no money for this. Then you have to really scratch your head and see how you're going to make it happen. Complicated institutional structure and management. So who takes responsibilities for changing operational and other modes that are in place for a long time is always a complicated issue. Lack of agency beyond institutional boundaries. So who is responsible and who is willing and able to do the work. Lack of leadership or high-level buy-in. Lack of bottom-up buy-in. So even students and staff and faculty may not fully support it. So co-production is always important. Complex political barriers can be there. Lack of staff capacity across the university. So who will actually implement it on the ground? Lack of organizational structure to make it happen. Difficulty in scaling solutions or implementing required time frames. Difficulty in sourcing equipment in low and middle income countries. So we belong in there. Lack of data and training. So the key considerations for mapping a university or college net zero plan or a strategy then: define the boundaries of the university or college, including whether a single campus or multiple campuses are covered by net zero. Fairly straightforward. Ensure that core university or college activities within the defined boundary are covered. So you have now these ideas of institutional analysis that we are discussing under sustainability. Evaluate the financing options available for net zero initiatives, including building the case for funding, private alumni funding, government funding. There may be even options for borrowing the money and paying it back. Evaluate the financial, reputational, legal, and market risks of not having a net zero plan. This includes ensuring relevant regulations on climate change and net zero are considered in whatever plans and strategies are drawn up. Ensure the plan receives buy-in from all relevant stakeholders, especially from university leadership and decision makers. Many times for a central government institute you may even need government permission to do many things. The autonomy doesn't go that far to do whatever you want. Continuing it, plan and strategize. Benefits and costs involved in a net zero plan have to be known. The lifetime costs and benefits of net zero initiatives are typically considered in financial terms. At the same time, benefits can be non-financial, such as improved health of the communities, better climate resilience of the university college's operations, local air quality improvements, and reputational benefits, as well as benefits to the community that's around the campus. By quantifying these benefits, net zero initiatives have greater likelihood of support and buy-in from key stakeholders. So the tips for increasing financial viability of net zero projects is also discussed here. Consider using a shadow carbon price in financial evaluations of projects in line with international standards. There is a social cost of carbon idea which is around and is being used maybe by Europeans more than anybody else. Very difficult to compute. Each additional ton of carbon, how much damage does it do to air quality, health, productivity, quality of life, standards of living, whatever. But including that in the financial evaluation of projects may help realize non-market goods in terms of the benefits, because cost-benefit analysis can be cut and dry with benefits accruing in the future, non-market goods not being accounted for carefully, including ecosystem services of vegetation, biodiversity on campus, and so on. Explore green financing options for net zero projects, including green bonds and green loans, which may provide additional benefits to a standard loan type. It's of course possible that national governments and international banks will begin to consider net zero campus activities as worthy efforts that need special financial tools to help build. Discuss and develop internal processes with the finance team to qualify some of the long-term benefits of net zero initiatives. Negotiate with the vendors and re-evaluate existing arrangements to reflect revised net zero visions and project requirements. So universities do a lot of buying of material, equipments, of course food and energy and water and mobility and so on. So all the vendors can be trained to stick to your net zero goals and standards, right? So looking at table 1, a broad list of climate change related financial impacts and non-financial benefits could be relevant to universities and colleges. So you are looking at types here. So first 3 columns of this table adapted with minor changes from another report. Climate related opportunities, potential financial impacts, and potential non-financial benefits, so adapted again from elsewhere. Resource efficiency, energy source, products and services, markets, and resilience are under the type of climate change related financial impacts. Climate related opportunities, use of more efficient modes of transport, reusing, recycling, shifting to more efficient buildings and site infrastructure, so using energy sources which are lower emission or renewable, supportive policy incentives, and so on. And potential financial impacts can be reduced operating costs through efficiency gains and cost reductions, increased value of fixed assets such as high rated energy efficient buildings, reduced exposure to liabilities related to health and safety. So overall, if campus gets much more safe and healthy, then you tend to gain external benefits from reduced expenses and liabilities. For energy source, you have in terms of financial impacts, reduced operational costs, reduced exposure to future fossil fuel price increases, reduced exposure to greenhouse gases, returns on investments in developing low emission technologies, and increased capital availability. So this innovation part has to be really emphasized. If you're on a campus and you're trying to solve a big problem, nothing is more critical than driving innovation on campus, whether it's carbon capture, more efficient storage, batteries, battery technologies, adaptation instruments, early warnings, mitigation, and so on and so forth. Non-financial benefits include health, safety, access to reliable sources of energy and energy security, and creation of green jobs as a part of the training. And there are lots of other things here which I will not read, but resilience wise you have climate related financial benefits in terms of participation in renewable energy programs and adoption of energy efficiency measures and resource substitutes and diversification. That was in the climate related opportunities and potential benefits, financial and non-financial. Increased market valuation through resilience planning for infrastructure, land and building. Increased reliability of supply chain and ability to operate under various conditions as climate change begins to throw up acute and chronic stressors. And increased revenue through research and education related to building climate resilience. More and more corporations may come to you to seek advice, solutions by startups, and many opportunities exist. I would almost think of this as evolutionary timescale opportunity to actually make money by developing solutions for decarbonization. Building resilience to survive disruption is a non-market good. Building resilience of communities to survive disruptions in resource access, and the amplification will come from the communities around you looking at the campus being so resilient to hazards and thinking they must be doing something right, and then they want to learn and do things with you. Another point in planning and strategizing: set clearly defined milestones and targets. Net zero plan must have multi-year targets and milestones to be achieved. This allows for regular monitoring of progress to ensure the university is on track to meet the end goal of net zero. So monitoring and evaluation is always critical in terms of set targets and making sure we are progressing towards them. Science-based targets, SBTs, is a new thing. Our green gas reduction goals aligned with the largest climate science that describes what is needed to achieve specific goal, or for example a 1.5 degree world. So here you are being guided not just by using what's in the market and trying to do your emissions reductions, move towards net zero, but you use science. It may involve nature-based solutions on campus where you are using vegetations to sequester carbon and reduce pollution and so on and so forth. These targets are typically a mix of science-based absolute emissions reductions across all scopes of greenhouse gases, combined with considerations of universities' long-term goals and its ability to manage resource and capabilities. Okay, so here interim targets are part of the minimum criteria required for participation in the Race to Zero campaign under the UN. So you have to pledge, plan, proceed and publish. So pledge to reach net zero as soon as possible and set an interim target for your fair share of 50% reduction by 2030. So there is a timeline involved there for 50% reduction of the current emissions. It's not unlike countries where GDP intensity is considered. Here you have to consider absolute levels. Plan within 12 months of joining. Explain what actions will be taken for achieving both interim and longer term pledges. Proceed. Take immediate meaningful action consistent with the short and long term targets specified. In fact, 2030 is right here around the corner. So if you are really going to be part of it, you must start yesterday, right? Publish. Report progress annually by publishing against your targets on a public platform so that transparency is really ensured. Okay, so I did mention best practices, so I'll go ahead and read this as well. Best practice for setting emissions targets. A critical starting point is identifying a valid base year. So you have to have a target baseline year on which you will base all your future targets. This should be a year that is representative of the institution's typical emissions profile, that has verifiable scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, define the boundaries of the university or college to ensure that all significant campuses and activities are covered. Net zero plans should include medium-term targets that track progress and mark major milestones such as halving emissions from the base year by 2030. As you can imagine, the older the date you go back to, the more cutting you will have to do, because your emissions will hopefully be lower as you go back in time. So by 2030, if not earlier, these medium-term or interim targets also enable the timely review of the performance against the latest developments in climate change mitigation and adaptation. Reducing scope 1 and 2 emissions are key milestones that need to be achieved in the early to mid-term, as scope 3 emissions typically need longer timelines because you have much less control on those, since they are mostly coming from third parties in many instances. It's highly recommended that initiatives consisting of offsets and carbon capture technologies are only used for hardest to abate emissions and after all the other initiatives have been implemented. Offsets have generally been not working, and they're hard to track because you're paying a third party in some ways to offset your emissions, and carbon capture is still not there in terms of scalability, but these should be seen as drivers of innovation on campus itself. So here are the key elements of setting targets and interim targets using a science-based pathway towards net zero. So here are tons of CO2 equivalent, so that you account not only for CO2 but also other greenhouse gases, and you do use offsets which should just be phased out over time, so you may have larger offsets in the beginning, but as you head towards emissions pathways you begin to have more and more net zero negative emission technologies and so on. So here you have reduction of greenhouse gas emissions within the value chain, removal and storage of the carbon emissions happening as well, abatement or removal beyond a company's value chain, which is the gray that is shown here, and net zero emissions, the target year by 2050 at the latest. So 5 to 10 years you have interim targets here, and net zero by or before 2050 here. So that's the path on top that is showing 1.5 degrees C aligned. So removal and storage is shown here, which has to continue to increase, because even as you reduce emissions, there are going to be irreducible emissions which have to be offset by carbon capture, utilization and sequestration, which is another rich target for innovation as well. So we will leave this here and come back and look at implement and innovate step of the net zero on campuses. Okay.